Chapter 1. The Runaway Bride. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a fiery orange glow over the prairie, painting the vast land with streaks of gold and crimson. The wind, hot and dry, whispered to the sagebrush and dusted the edges of the worn dirt road. Lila Dawson's heart pounded in her chest as she urged her horse, a sleek bay named Thunder, to gallop faster. The world blurred around her, a whirlwind of dust, fear, and freedom. She had barely heard the shot, the sharp crack of a rifle, then a sharp pain in her back as the bullet grazed her. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't dare slow. She couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. The wedding dress she wore, now stained with dirt and blood, fluttered behind her like a white ghost as she pushed Thunder harder. The wind tugged at the long veil draped over her head, threatening to choke her with its fabric. Her groom, Charles O'Reilly, had called for this marriage, a business deal disguised as love. He never cared for her, not the way a man should, not with tenderness or affection. She was merely a prize to him, a way to secure his future, to settle his father's debts. Lila didn't care about the bullet, didn't care about the world that had caged her. She only cared about escaping the life her father had chosen for her, escaping the man who thought he could own her. Thunder's hooves thudded against the earth, the rhythmic beat matching the frantic pounding in her chest. The town was miles behind her now. She had no destination, only the promise of freedom as her only hope. Her hands gripped the reins with white-knuckled desperation, a tear slipping down her cheek despite the dry heat of the wind. It wasn't the dirt on her face, but the weight of everything she had left behind that made her feel raw and exposed. A shout echoed behind her. Then another, a dozen men, Charles among them, shouting her name, shouting threats. Lila's breath hitched as the sound of hooves pounded toward her. They were gaining. She pushed Thunder harder, urging the horse on, her voice barely a whisper through clenched teeth. "I can't stop. I won't stop," she murmured, half to herself, half to the sky, as if the wild land could hear her defiance. But then, from a corner of her eye, she saw it, a rider emerging from the edge of the canyon. A cowboy, his silhouette framed against the red sky. His horse was fast, and his posture even faster, a figure that seemed to belong to the land itself. She barely had time to react when a sharp pain burst through her side, followed by a scream she couldn't quite control. Her body lurched, and Thunder bucked under her, tossing her into the dirt. The cowboy was there before the world went dark. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she was running or who was chasing her. He only reached down, pulling her up with one hand and his arm around her waist, strong and steady. "You're safe now, miss," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, roughened by the land itself. Lila's head swam with dizziness. Her pulse raced, but not from fear anymore. The sharp tang of gunpowder hung in the air, mixing with the scent of sagebrush and horse sweat. She could barely make out the man's face, his features hidden by the wide brim of his hat, but there was something in the way he held her, in the way he steadied her, that made her feel more alive than she had in years. "Who are you?" she gasped, her voice shaky as she fought to stay conscious. "Cole Langston," he said, his lips tight as he glanced back over his shoulder. "And you got a hell of a lot to explain when you're able." His words, rough but not unkind, didn't need an answer. For now, Lila had nothing to give but her trembling breath and the hope that, for once, someone might save her from the life that had been forced upon her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila closed her eyes, the last light of the day casting a warm glow over them both. The cowboy hadn't asked her a single question, but something in his steady gaze told her he already knew. And for the first time in a long while, Lila felt like she might just be able to trust someone. Chapter 2. The Cowboy's Promise. Lila's eyes fluttered open to the smell of burning pine and the soft crackle of a fire. Her head felt heavy, her body achy as if it had been pulled through a storm. The first thing she noticed was a heat, a dry warmth that clung to her skin, different from the suffocating heat of the wedding day. She wasn't sure where she was, but she could hear the steady creak of a rocking chair and the quiet rustle of the wind brushing against a nearby window. The cabin was small but cozy, its rough-hewn walls lined with old leather and tattered wood. The faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air, and Lila could hear the rhythmic sound of boots scraping the floorboards as someone moved. A faint cough echoed in the dimly lit room, the only light coming from a lantern that hung near the hearth. "Easy now, miss," a voice rumbled from the shadows. Lila tensed, her heart leaping in her chest, and her hand instinctively reached for the side where the bullet had grazed her. The pain was dulled, but the wound still throbbed. She blinked and slowly turned her head, her vision blurry. The silhouette of the cowboy stood by the hearth, a lone figure casting a long shadow across the room. He had taken his hat off, revealing the wild, dark hair beneath, and his broad shoulders filled the doorway like the rugged land he came from. "Cole Langston. Where am I?" Lila's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You're safe." His words were steady, like the wind sweeping over the plains, unyielding and calm. He didn't meet her gaze, but his hands moved skillfully, sewing a fresh cloth bandage around her wound. "It's a cabin I keep near my ranch. You've been out for a few hours, but you're not dead yet, so that's something." Lila tried to sit up, but winced as pain flared through her side. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt a tremble spread through her limbs. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He was there, a strong arm beneath her back, lifting her up gently. "Don't push it, miss. You'll be fine, just give it time." She met his eyes then, the warmth of the fire flickering in his gaze, the softness in the corners of his dark eyes that seemed at odds with the ruggedness of his face. His face was hard, weathered by years under the sun, but there was a tenderness in the way he held her, a silent promise. Lila wanted to ask him everything: who he was, why he was helping her, what would happen when Charles found her, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she looked around the room, eyes darting to the small stove, the sparse furnishings. It was a far cry from the lavishness of the mansion she had grown up in, with its polished floors and polished smiles. "What happened to them?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking with the raw edge of her fear. "The men! Charles, are they coming after me?" Cole's face hardened, a flicker of something darker passing through his expression, but he remained quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, looking out the small window as the sounds of the wilderness filtered in, the distant cry of a coyote, the gentle rustle of the trees. The evening was settling, the dark blue sky stretching over the desert like an endless canvas. "They'll come," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "But they won't find you here. Not tonight." Lila's breath caught in her chest. "Why are you helping me?" The question felt raw, vulnerable. She had no right to ask. She didn't even know this man, and yet here he was, tending to her as if she mattered. Cole glanced at her, his expression unreadable. He leaned against the wall, folding his arms, his eyes never leaving hers. "I don't rightly know. Maybe it's because I've seen too many women suffer at the hands of men who think they own them. Maybe it's just the right thing to do. Either way, you're here now. I won't turn you away." Lila's heart skipped a beat, the weight of his words settling deep within her chest. She had never known kindness like this. Her father, her groom, every man who had ever touched her life had only seen her as a possession, something to be owned. But Cole saw her as something different, something worth saving. "I didn't ask for this," Lila whispered, the truth of it heavy in her chest. To be saved, to be anything. She averted her gaze, unwilling to let him see the tears brimming in her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. "You don't have to ask." Cole said quietly, his voice a low growl that was laced with something tender. "I'm just here to make sure you get to live another day. You deserve that." For the first time in as long as she could remember, Lila felt something shift inside her. The knot of fear that had coiled tight in her chest since her father had sold her into that marriage loosened, if only a little. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but she knew this. Cole Langston wasn't like the men she had known. He was something different. And for the first time in her life, Lila let herself feel it. "I'll make you a deal," Cole said suddenly, breaking the silence that hung thick between them. "You rest here tonight. Get yourself together. And tomorrow, we'll figure out where to go from here. But don't go thinking you have to run again. You're safe with me." She met his gaze, feeling the weight of his promise in the quiet air between them. No words passed between them, but the unspoken understanding was all too clear. Lila, for the first time in years, allowed herself to rest, in a place where there were no chains, no debts, no promises broken. And with that, the first glimmer of something she hadn't known she still had, the faintest glimmer of hope, began to take root. Chapter 3. Whispers and Gunshots. The days that followed were a strange blend of comfort and tension. Cole's cabin, though sparse, was a sanctuary, a place where Lila could let her guard down, if only a little. The wild, untamed beauty of the land stretched out before her, a vast expanse of rolling hills and golden grass. She'd never felt so free, so far from the confines of her life back home. But even in this haven, the shadows of her past lingered. Each morning, Cole would saddle up Thunder and take care of the chores at his ranch. Lila would help when she could, fetching water from the well or mending small repairs around the cabin. The physical work was hard, but it gave her something to focus on other than the fear that gnawed at the edges of her mind. The connection between them deepened each day, though neither of them spoke of it. It was there in the way Cole would look at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in the way he'd steady her when she stumbled or winced from her injury. But Lila couldn't bring herself to ask him why he was doing it, why he hadn't simply left her to fend for herself. She didn't deserve his kindness. The evenings were the hardest. When the sun sank behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the prairie, Lila would sit outside the cabin, her thoughts as scattered as the wind that swept over the land. She could hear the distant sounds of coyotes calling to each other, the creaking of the old wooden porch under Cole's boots. Sometimes they'd sit together in silence, watching the sky turn from pink to deep blue. But it wasn't enough. The fear inside her clawed its way back to the surface, sharp as a knife, whenever she thought about Charles and the men he had sent after her. "You think they're out there?" Lila asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared out at the endless expanse of land. Cole didn't answer right away. He was leaning against the porch railing, his hat tipped low over his brow, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He blew a slow stream of smoke into the air before speaking, his voice steady as always. "I'd be a fool to think they're not. A man like your Groom don't let go that easy." Lila's stomach twisted at the mention of Charles. She tried not to think of him, but the memories had a way of creeping back. His cold smile, his sharp words, the way he touched her with hands that never knew kindness. Her escape had been a dream, one she wasn't sure would last. "You don't have to help me," she said suddenly, her voice laced with a mix of gratitude and shame. "I never asked for this. I never asked you to." Her words faltered as she turned away from him, the emotions inside her too tangled to make sense of. Cole was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the occasional rustle of the wind. Then his deep voice broke the silence, soft but unwavering. "I don't need you to ask. You're here now, and I'm not the kind of man to leave someone behind when they need help." Lila swallowed, fighting the lump in her throat. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, simply nodding as if that would make everything clearer. But she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. That night, as the stars sparkled above them, Lila lay awake in a small bed in the corner of the cabin, the creaking of the floorboards echoing in the stillness. The silence was oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She had tried to sleep, but the worry gnawed at her, making rest impossible. Suddenly, a distant noise shattered the quiet. The sound of hooves pounding against the dirt, far too many to be a casual rider. Lila's heart leapt in her chest, and she sat up, her pulse racing. Cole's voice, low and tense, came from the other side of the cabin. "Get to the back. Now." Lila didn't question him. She scrambled from the bed, her feet barely touching the ground as she moved toward the back door. Cole was already at the window, peering out into the darkness. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, and his hand hovered near the holster at his waist. "They're here," he muttered, more to himself than to Lila. "I knew it." Lila's breath caught in her throat. The reality of it hit her like a fist. Charles and his men had finally tracked her down. She didn't have the luxury of wondering what would happen next. She had to act. "You don't have to fight them," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We can run. You've already helped me enough." "I'm not about to let them take you back," Cole interrupted, his tone sharp, final. He moved toward the door, his spurs clinking softly as he did. Lila's heart pounded in her chest, and she rushed to his side, her hand on his arm. "Please don't," she begged, her voice thick with fear. Cole turned to her then, his face softening for a moment before hardening again. "You don't need to worry about me. Just stay out of the way, Lila. I'll handle this." She nodded, though the tightness in her chest refused to loosen. She could hear the men getting closer now, their voices rising in the night, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching against the dirt. Cole stepped outside, the sharp night air cutting through the heat of the cabin. Lila stood frozen in the doorway, her heart in her throat as she watched him face the incoming threat, standing tall and unyielding like the land he called home. The first shout came, followed by a shot that echoed into the night. Lila flinched, but Cole didn't move, his stance steady. Another shot rang out, and the familiar sound of gunfire set her on edge. But then, through the haze of panic, she realized something. Cole wasn't retreating. He was standing his ground. For her, as the men closed in, the tension thickened like the dust before a storm. And in that moment, Lila realized that there was no running anymore. She wasn't just a fugitive anymore. She was someone worth fighting for. And Cole Langston wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. Chapter 4. The storm before the calm. The morning after the gunfight. Everything seemed to hold its breath. The wind, once fierce and howling, had calmed to a soft breeze that whispered across the plains. The air smelled of dust and sagebrush, and the sky above stretched clear and blue, unmarred by the storm that had come the night before. But inside the cabin, the tension lingered like the aftertaste of gunpowder, and Lila couldn't shake the knot of worry twisting in her stomach. She had been half expecting Cole to leave. After all, he had done his part. He protected her from the men sent by her groom. But she wasn't naive enough to think they'd stop there. Charles would come again, and this time they might not be so lucky. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Lila sat on the porch, her eyes scanning the distant hills. The land, so vast and wild, felt like a stranger to her, a land she wasn't sure she could ever truly belong to. Yet it had become the place where she had finally felt something she hadn't in years, peace. It was a fragile thing, like the first light of dawn breaking through the night, but it was there nonetheless. Cole, as always, was out working the land, tending to his ranch. His broad shoulders moved with purpose as he rode from one end of the property to the other, checking fences and water troughs. His movements were steady, efficient. Everything about him seemed grounded, rooted in the land he worked and the life he led. Lila wanted to help, to do something other than sit and watch. But the wound in her side still throbbed, and every movement reminded her that she wasn't yet strong enough to fight her own battles. She watched Cole for a moment longer, the way he moved with ease, as if he were part of the land itself. He was a man who knew the rhythm of the earth, the way the seasons changed, and the way the land responded to hard work and care. She knew, deep down, that Cole wasn't like the men she had known. He wasn't cold or calculating. He didn't see her as a prize to be won or a tool to further his own ambitions. He had saved her, and in the process, had shown her a kindness she had never known. But that same kindness was making her heart ache, a feeling she wasn't ready to confront. She had been hurt too many times to allow herself to hope for something better, something real. Love, she had learned, was nothing more than a dangerous illusion, a trap set by men who only wanted to possess what they could never understand. The sound of hooves brought her back to the present, and she turned to see Cole riding back toward the cabin. His face was set in that familiar, quiet expression, but there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of something, like a storm on the horizon. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood to meet him. Cole dismounted, his boots kicking up a small cloud of dust as he landed. He tied Thunder to the hitching post before looking at her, his eyes shadowed with something that she couldn't quite place. "They've been here," he said, his voice low and serious. "Tracks fresh ones. They're looking for you, Lila." Her heart skipped in her chest, the sudden rush of fear hitting her like a tidal wave. The knot in her stomach tightened. She had known, deep down, that this wouldn't be over, but hearing Cole say it out loud made it all the more real. "How close?" she managed to ask, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "Too close," he answered, his gaze hardening. "I'm not going to let them get you again." He started toward the barn, his jaw set with determination, but Lila followed, her heart pounding in her chest. This time, they couldn't run. There was nowhere to run to. The land was too vast, and even if they rode for days, there would always be men behind them, tracking them down. "I don't want you to get hurt, Cole," Lila said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You've done enough for me. I can't." He turned to her then, his face softening for the briefest moment. "It's not about what you want, Lila. It's about keeping you safe. And I won't stop until you are." Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The choices she had made, the life she had tried to leave behind, the man who had sent her running. She had never wanted to be the cause of anyone's pain. She had never wanted to drag anyone into her mess. But standing there, looking into Cole's dark eyes, she realized something. He wasn't just fighting for her. He was fighting for something more, something that neither of them could name. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Cole turned back toward the barn, his hand brushing the leather of his saddle. "We don't have much time. Get what you need. We're heading out." Lila stood frozen for a moment, the storm of emotions inside her threatening to swallow her whole. But then, with a sharp breath, she nodded. There was no turning back now. She couldn't run anymore. She followed him inside, her fingers trembling as she packed a small bag with what little she could carry. The weight of the decision was heavy, but the promise in Cole's eyes was even heavier. He wasn't just offering her a place to hide. He was offering her a chance at something more, a chance to fight for something she hadn't thought possible, a future. As they saddled up and rode into the fading light of the evening, the sky over the prairie darkened, the stars beginning to appear one by one. The wind picked up, swirling around them as if nature itself was holding its breath. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her voice quiet against the sound of the wind and their horses' hooves. Cole didn't answer right away. He simply pushed his hat back, his face set with resolve. "Wherever it takes to keep you safe. We ride until the storm passes." The storm of her past was closing in, and she could feel in the air, sharp and unforgiving. But for the first time, Lila didn't feel alone. The cowboy beside her was more than just a protector. He was a man who understood the way of the world and still chose to stand tall, even when it seemed impossible. And in that moment, Lila realized something. She didn't have to fight this battle alone. Not anymore. Chapter 5, A Love in the Dust. The day had come, and the quiet of the cabin felt like a false peace. The tension was thick in the air, the dust of the previous night's storm lingering in the corners of the room, as if even the land itself was holding its breath. Lila and Cole had been on the move for days, always a step ahead of the men sent by her groom. But today, the silence felt different. It felt like the calm before the storm. Cole hadn't said much, but Lila could see it in his eyes, the worry that was starting to crease his brow. He was a man who was used to facing danger head-on, but even he couldn't deny the weight of the situation anymore. She could hear him working in the barn, his boots scraping against the wooden floor as he went about his chores, preparing for something. What exactly? She wasn't sure, but it was clear that today wasn't going to be like the others. The sun hung high in the sky, casting harsh shadows over the land, the heat of the day pressing in on everything. Lila stood outside, her hand resting lightly on the porch railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her heart fluttered with anticipation, each passing minute feeling like a countdown. She could feel the pulse of danger, the steady approach of something she couldn't outrun. Charles and his men were coming, and this time they wouldn't stop until they had her. She tried to push the thought away, to focus on the steady rhythm of her breath, but the anxiety coiled in her chest, tightening with every passing moment. Cole stepped out of the barn, his face grim, his gaze scanning the horizon. He didn't say anything at first, but Lila could feel the weight of his presence beside her. He had always been there, standing tall and steady, his quiet strength a constant reassurance. But now, even he seemed to carry the burden of the storm that was about to break. "We don't have much time," Cole said, his voice low and steady. "They're closing in." Lila nodded, her stomach twisting. She wanted to ask them what they were going to do, but she knew the answer already. There was no running this time. There was nowhere left to hide. Do you think we can outrun them?" Lila asked, her voice trembling more than she intended. Cole met her gaze, his expression softening just for a moment. "It's not about outrunning them. It's about standing our ground." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with the force of something that felt bigger than the moment. Stand their ground. He wasn't just talking about escaping anymore. He was talking about fighting for something. Something they both had come to realize they wanted. Something they couldn't deny. "Come inside," he said softly, taking her hand and leading her back to the cabin. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of tobacco and old wood, the flickering lantern casting long shadows across the room. He moved with purpose, gathering his weapons, his boots scraping against the floor as he readied himself for what was coming. Lila watched him, her heart racing. A part of her wanted to run, and another part of her wanted to stay, to stand beside him and face whatever was coming together. "Cole," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't have to do this. You've already given me more than I deserve." He paused, his back to her, as he tightened his gun belt, his fingers brushing over the worn leather. He turned then, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You deserve more than anyone I've ever known," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm not about to let some man take you from me. Not without a fight." Lila's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. For the first time since she had run, she felt the walls around her heart begin to crack. He had fought for her before, but now, in this moment, it was clear that this fight wasn't just for survival. It was for something deeper, something neither of them could deny any longer. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch his arm. "Cole," she whispered, her voice faltering, unsure of how to express the gratitude, the love, that was suddenly flooding her heart. Cole took a step closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His touch spoke louder than words ever could. In that simple, quiet moment, Lila felt it. The bond between them, unspoken yet undeniable, binding them together in the face of everything that threatened to tear them apart. A loud crack split the air, the sound of a rifle shot in the distance. Lila's heart leapt in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She knew what that sound meant. They were here. "Stay inside," Cole said, his voice steady, though his jaw was clenched tight. "Lock the door." Lila didn't argue. She turned and hurried to the door, her heart pounding in her chest, but as she reached for the handle, she stopped. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. Not of Charles. Not of the men. Not of the unknown that lay ahead. She knew what she had to do. She turned back to Cole, her eyes locking with his. "I'm not staying behind, Cole." "Not this time." He didn't respond right away, but the look he gave her, one of quiet understanding, spoke volumes. "Then let's make this count," he said, his voice low, full of determination. The door opened with a creak, and they stepped out into the dry heat of the afternoon. The wind blew, and the dust swirled around them, catching in the corners of Lila's eyes. But she didn't blink. She didn't flinch. For the first time, she felt strong. She felt like she had something worth fighting for. And with Cole by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. The sound of hooves grew louder in the distance. The storm was coming, but Lila didn't fear it. Not anymore. Together, they would face it head on. Together, they would make their stand. Chapter 6. Under the western sky, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft twilight glow. The sky stretched above them like a canvas of deep indigo, dotted with the first bright stars of the evening. The land was quiet, save for the occasional whisper of the wind stirring the dry grasses and the distant howls of coyotes calling to one another. The world, it seemed, was holding its breath. Lila sat on the worn wooden bench outside the cabin, her legs stretched out in front of her, and her boots resting on the dry earth. The ranch was still and peaceful, so different from the chaos that had surrounded her for so long. She could hear the faint clink of Cole's spurs as he moved behind her, and for the first time since she had run from Charles, the air around her felt free. She was no longer looking over her shoulder at every shadow, no longer hearing the pounding of hooves in the distance, knowing that danger was always just a step behind. Cole had been quiet all afternoon, his mind clearly somewhere else. She could tell he was still on alert, as he always was, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand never far from his gun. But there was something different in the way he moved today. The storm that had raged between them, the tension, the unspoken fear, it was gone, replaced by a strange kind of peace. Lila turned her head slightly, watching him as he moved toward the stables, his broad shoulders casting long shadows in the fading light. Cole's gaze met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. He was a man who had weathered many storms, both literal and figurative, but the storm between them, the one that kept them from saying what was in their hearts, had finally passed. The weight of everything they'd been through, the gunfights, the danger, the fear of losing each other, it had all led to this moment, to this quiet space and time where they could finally breathe. Without a word, he moved toward her, his boots thudding softly against the dirt. He didn't sit beside her at first. Instead, he stood a few paces away, watching her, his hand resting lightly on the saddle horn. Lila looked up at him, her heart fluttering in her chest. The man who had saved her, who had fought for her when she had nothing left to fight with. He was standing there, as solid and steady as the land beneath them. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Charles would never stop searching for her, and their love, whatever it was, would be tested by everything life had thrown at them. But in this moment, the weight of it all seemed to lift. The future was uncertain, but there was something undeniable about the way Cole had stood by her. He had chosen her, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to, and for the first time in her life, Lila felt seen. "Cole," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for him to hear. He didn't answer right away, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. For a brief moment, they stood there, the space between them filled with a quiet understanding that needed no words. The prairie stretched out before them, vast and empty, the world wide open. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. "I didn't ask for any of this, Lila, but I'm glad it brought you to me." Lila's heart skipped a beat at his words. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt. His gaze was unwavering, as if he had always known that this was where he was meant to be, standing in front of her, offering her a future they would build together. "I never thought I'd be here," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Never thought I'd find someone who would care for me. Not like this." Cole's face softened as he stepped closer, his boots dragging gently through the dust. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his fingers lingering on her skin for a brief moment. "Maybe that's the way it's meant to be," he said, his voice low and warm. "Maybe we were both meant to find something in each other we couldn't find anywhere else." The words settled between them, heavy with the weight of everything they had both been through. Lila reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, and in that small gesture, the years of isolation, of fear, of running, seemed to vanish. Cole didn't pull away. Instead, he took her hand in his grip firm and reassuring. The connection between them was palpable, like the land itself was binding them together, roots growing deep into the earth beneath their feet. "I don't know what comes next," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I know I don't want to face it alone." Cole gave her a small, tender smile, and for the first time, Lila saw something in his eyes that made her heart swell. Hope, not just for the future, but for what they could have together, despite the dangers that still loomed. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was protecting something else too, a future they could carve out of the wild land together. "You don't have to," he said softly. "Not anymore." They stood there in the fading light, hand in hand, as the stars began to fill the sky above them. The prairie stretched on, vast and unending, but for the first time, it didn't feel so empty. It felt full of possibility, full of promise. And as the night fell around them, Lila knew that no matter what came next, she wasn't running anymore. She wasn't alone anymore. They had each other. And that was enough. The sun hung low over the plains, casting the sky in a breathtaking wash of gold and crimson as the day drew to a close. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush in the earth, a steady breeze carrying the whispers of distant coyotes. The sound of horses' hooves drummed in the silence, the rhythmic beat a familiar companion to the wild landscape. Lila stood at the edge of the small ranch, her hand resting lightly on the wooden fence, her gaze drawn to the horizon. Cole's silhouette appeared against the orange sky as he rode toward her, his figure framed by the fading light. The wind tugged at his wide-brimmed hat and ruffled his shirt, but he didn't seem to care. He was the same steady, quiet cowboy who had saved her from the life she had once known, but there was something different about him now, something soft in the way he looked at her. As he dismounted, the sound of the saddle creaking in the stillness, he took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no need for words. The weight of everything they had been through hung in the air between them. The gunfights, the fear, the escape. But in that moment, All of it seemed to melt away. "I'm not afraid anymore," Lila whispered, her voice breaking the silence. Cole stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers, the heat of his touch grounding her. "You never were," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Under the wide, open sky, the world felt like it had come full circle. They had fought for survival, and in the process, they had found each other. Together, they were more than the past they had run from. They were the future they had chosen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turning from orange to deep purple, Cole pulled her close, and in that quiet, dust-choked moment, their lips met, a kiss that spoke of redemption, of love born from the wild heart of the West.